The morning of the dispersal sale, there were 22 skinny cows nobody wanted, and they stood in the far back pen at the Callahan County stockyard, where the sun came down hardest and the water trough had gone to green scum, and they stood the way starved cattle stand, which is to say without complaint, their hips sharp under loose hide, their heads low, their ribs counting themselves for anyone who cared to count, and nobody cared to count. The crowd moved through the good pens up front, the sleek black baldies and the fat feeder steers with their coats like poured oil, and the men leaned on the rails and talked prices and rain and the lack of rain, and when the auctioneer's voice rolled out over the loudspeaker, it rolled over those front pens like weather, and the money moved there, and the hats nodded there, and the whole living current of the place ran toward the animals that looked like money, and away from the animals that looked like a mistake. And at the back, where the mistake stood, one person had stopped walking. She was tall and wiry through the shoulders, and she stood with her boots square in the dust, and her gloves tucked in her back pocket, and her hands resting on the top rail. And she looked at the 22 cows, the way most people look at a thing they are trying to read, rather than a thing they have already judged. And she did not wrinkle her nose at the smell, and she did not turn away. Her name was Delia Reyes, and she was 28 years old, and 3 weeks earlier she had buried the last of the life she used to have, and she had come back to the county with a certificate she never used, folded in a drawer, and an old 3/4-ton truck that composed its own obituary every time it idled, and no plan to speak of. Only nowhere else on the earth she needed to be. She had a low braid of straight black hair pulled over one shoulder, and a faint white scar through her right eyebrow that she had carried so long she had forgotten the fence that gave it to her, and she wore a cream Henley gone soft at the cuffs under a rust-brown chore jacket that had been her grandfather's before it had been anybody's, and she looked at the cows a long time. She saw what the other men saw, which was hunger, but she saw the thing under the hunger, which the other men did not stop long enough to see, and the thing under the hunger was that these were not sick cows, and they were not old cows, and they were not, most of them, poorly bred cows. They were cows that had been run too hard on ground that had been run too hard, cows that had eaten a place down to the dirt and then been blamed for the dirt, and their eyes were clear, and their legs were clean, and their jaws worked steady, and one old brindle near the gate lifted her head and looked back at Delia with the flat, unbothered patience of an animal that had survived every reason it had been given to die. And a voice came up beside her, loud and easy and pleased with itself, and it belonged to Wade Coleman, who ran 400 head on the good bottomland east of town, and who had never in his life stood at the back pens, because there had never been a reason a man like Wade Coleman would stand at the back pens. And he said, "Well now, you're not looking at those, are you?" And Delia did not turn her head, and she said she might be. And Wade laughed the laugh of a man laughing for an audience he assumes is there, and he said, "Those aren't cows. Those are coyote dinners on the hoof. Those are a taxidermy problem waiting to happen." And he said, "You buy those, and you'll be hauling them off one at a time all summer, and you'll be feeding a vet more than you'll ever feed yourself." And he told her, plainly and with real amusement, that inside of a year she'd be selling the hides for dog leather and burying the rest, and that would be the whole of it. And it would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. But that morning, it landed the way he meant it to land, and a few of the men near enough to hear it grinned into their coffee, and the auctioneer's voice came around at last, to the back pens the way you get to the dishes you have been putting off, and he ran the 22 through as one lot, no sale material, salvage weight, and he opened them low and got nothing, and dropped them lower and got nothing, and the whole sale seemed ready to simply pass them by and leave them standing in the green-scummed pen for whatever came next. And Delia lifted 2 fingers off the rail, and the number was so small it embarrassed the room, and it embarrassed the auctioneer, who repeated it twice, as if hoping to be corrected. and no man corrected it, because no man wanted them, and the gavel came down on the 22 skinny cows that nobody wanted, and they were hers, all of them, for less than the price of a good saddle. And Wade Coleman shook his head and walked back toward the front pens where the money was, still smiling. And Delia stayed at the rail a while longer, looking at what she had bought. And the old brindle looked back at her, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing yet to say. Before I take her home, do me one small thing, because it matters to me more than I can easily explain. If you are the kind of person who has ever been told that the thing you saw worth saving was worth nothing, tap the like button so this story reaches somebody else who needs it today. And leave me a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from, your town, your city, your country. Just the name of the place you call home, because I read every single one of them, every night, and it means something to me, to know the shape of who is out there in the quiet listening. That is all. Now let me tell you what she did with 22 cows nobody wanted. She loaded them herself, in 3 trips, in the old truck and a borrowed gooseneck that rattled like a box of bones, and it took her the better part of a long day, and into the blue edge of evening, and the cows loaded slow and unwilling, and she did not rush them, and she did not raise her voice, and when one balked, she put a bare hand flat on its shoulder, and stood there until it decided on its own that she was not a thing to fear, and then it walked on, and she drove them west out of town, on the county road, past the Coleman bottomland, lying green and irrigated behind its long straight fences, and past the Hendricks place and the old Tally place, and up into the broken country where the ground folds and the caliche shows through, and the mesquite has been fighting the grass for 100 years, and there at the end of a gravel lane that had washed to ruts stood the home place, which had been her family's since before the county had a name it kept, and which had passed down finally and improbably to her, because everyone else who might have taken it was either dead or gone, or had wanted no part of a played-out ranch in a dry corner of a dry country. The house leaned a little. The barn leaned more, and it leaned in a direction that made no sense to anyone who had ever built a barn. Its long, low roof pitched the wrong way, and its openings set where the wind would find them, and the fences sagged, and the corrals had rotted at the posts, and the whole place had the emptied-out feeling of a thing that had been waiting so long it had stopped expecting anyone. And there was one other soul on it, Delia's grandmother, Alma Reyes, who was 86 years old, and had lived on that ridge for 70 of those years, and had worn, near as anyone could tell, the same brown work coat for the last 40, sat on the porch in the last light, with a bowl of peas in her lap, shelling them one at a time into a can, and she watched the gooseneck come up the lane, and she watched the cattle come off the trailer into the near corral, one stiff-legged animal after another, and she did not get up, and she did not smile, and she shelled her peas. And when Delia had shut the gate, and stood a moment with her forearms on the top rail, looking at the 22 cows now standing in her own corral, under her own darkening sky, Alma spoke for the first time, and she said, without heat and without wonder, "So you bought the sorry ones." And Delia said she had. And Alma looked at the cattle a while, and her old eyes went over them slow, over the hips and the ribs and the clean legs and the clear eyes, the same reading her granddaughter had made hours before at the back pens. And she came to the same place at the end of the reading, and she said, "They're not sorry cows, they're just hungry, and there is a difference, and most men your grandfather ever met couldn't tell it." And she went back to her peas. And that was the largest thing Alma Reyes said that night, and Delia would learn, over the seasons to come, that this was how the old woman gave everything she gave, sparingly, sideways, a tenth of what she thought offered as a fact for consideration, and the other 9/10 held back, so that when a word of approval finally came, it would weigh what it ought to weigh. and Delia carried that sentence up to the house and turned it over in the dark. "They're not sorry cows, they're just hungry." And she slept that night for the first time in 3 weeks without the thing in her chest that had followed her home. And outside, the 22 cows found the corral hay and put their heads down and ate. She began the next morning, the way she would begin every morning after, before the light was fully up, with the Henley and the chore jacket and the gloves and the boots, and she walked the fence lines of the home place to learn what she had, and what she had was not good. The grass, where there was grass, was the wrong grass, the shallow annual weeds and the cheat and the invaders that come in when the good, deep native bunch grasses have been grazed to death and give up their hold on the soil. And between the patches of wrong grass there was bare ground, hardpan baked and cracked, and where the rains had come, they had not soaked in. They had run off across the crust and gathered in the drawers and cut them deeper and taken the last of the topsoil down toward the river, and the whole ranch had the look of a place that had been asked to give more than it had for longer than it could, which was exactly what the 22 cows had looked like, and Delia understood. Standing on a bare knob at the top of the near pasture, with the wind pulling at her braid, that she had bought a starved herd to put on a starved land, and that anyone in the county would call that the stupidest thing a grieving young woman with no plan could possibly do, and that most of them, given the chance, already had. She did not argue with them, even in her own head. She simply started keeping notes, because keeping notes was the one thing she had always done, in the margins of anything, on the backs of receipts, a compulsion older than her grief. And she wrote down the bare knobs and the cut drawers and the wrong grass, and the 22 head, and the little water there was, and she did not yet know what the notes were for, only that a thing counted is a thing you can begin to change. And it was in the second week, up in the leaning barn, looking for anything that might be sold or salvaged or burned, that she found the trunk. It was a cedar trunk, gone grey, shoved under the loft stairs behind a broken cultivator and a coil of wire, and its lid had swelled shut with the damp of 40 winters, and she worked it open with a pry bar and the flat of her hand, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with baling twine, were the ledgers. There were 9 of them, bound in black board gone soft at the corners, and they were filled edge to edge in a small upright hand, dated across decades. The earliest of them from a year Delia had to count on her fingers to believe, and they belonged. The first page told her in that same careful hand, to Emmett Reyes. His book, The Home Place, and Emmett Reyes was her great-grandfather, dead 40 years and more, a name on a stone in the family plot up the ridge and nothing else to her, until that afternoon in the barn when he became, page by page, the only man in the county who seemed to be speaking directly to the trouble she was in. Because the ledgers were not a diary, and they were not accounts, or not mostly, they were a record of the land, kept the way a doctor keeps a chart, season by season, pasture by pasture, and Emmett Reyes had written down the rains to the 10th of an inch, and the dates the grasses greened, and the dates they cured, and where the cattle grazed, and for how many days, and where he moved them and why. And he had written it all around a single argument, made quietly, and repeated so often it became the spine of the 9 books. And the argument was this, that the ground is not dirt that grass happens to grow on. The ground is a living thing that the grass makes and the grass feeds, and that a man who grazes a pasture to the dirt and moves on has not saved money. He has spent the only thing he truly owns, and that the way you keep a dry country alive is not to fight the dry, but to farm the grass, so the grass will farm the soil, so the soil will hold the water, when at last the water comes. And Emmett had underlined, once, in the whole of the first ledger, in a hand pressed so hard it had nearly torn the page, 3 words, and the 3 words were, "The ground remembers." And Delia sat on the barn floor in the dust-hung light, with the ledger open on her knees, and she read that underlined line, "The ground remembers," and she did not yet know all it meant, and she would spend 4 years learning. But she knew enough that afternoon to understand that the leaning barn was not badly built, that Emmett Reyes had pitched its roof and set its openings exactly as he meant to shelter stock from the north norties and open to the summer south wind, that he had built the wrong kind of barn on purpose, the way he had done everything on that ranch on purpose. For a country and a way of ranching the rest of the world had forgotten and called foolish, and she carried all 9 ledgers to the house that evening, 2 trips, and she set them on the kitchen table, and Alma Reyes looked up from her knitting and looked at the black books a long moment, and something moved across the old woman's face that was not quite a smile, and she said, "So you found Emmett's books?" And Delia said she had, and Alma said, "He kept those for these," and she nodded once toward the window and the corral beyond it where the 22 cows stood in the dusk. "He kept those for a bad time and a hungry herd and somebody with the patience to read them." And she looked at her granddaughter with the flat, unsentimental measuring look that Delia was coming to know, and she said, "I wondered which of you it would be," and then she went back to her knitting, and the needles ticked in the quiet, and outside a cow lowed once and was still. What Emmett Reyes had written, Delia set out to do, slowly, in the only order the land and the season and her thin money would allow. And the first thing the ledgers told her, over and over across their 9 volumes, was that she was to stop doing the one thing every rancher in that country did, which was to turn the cattle out into a pasture and leave them there. And she was instead to gather the whole herd into one bunch, and hold them tight, and graze them hard on a small piece of ground for a very short time, and then move them, and to let the grazed piece rest a long time, a whole growing season and more if she could give it, so that the grass, bitten once and then left alone, could put its energy not into the leaf the cattle had taken, but down into the root, deeper and deeper, and the root, driving down after the falling water, would break the hard pan and feed the soil life and hold the ground where it stood when the rains ran hard, and the trampled dead grass the cattle mashed into the dirt as they went would lie there like a mulch and shade the crown and keep the little moisture there was from burning off in the wind. And to do that, she had to cut the ranch into pieces, and cutting the ranch into pieces meant fence, and she had almost no money for fence. And here Emmett met her again across the 40 years, because folded into the 3rd ledger were his own sketches for a cheap, movable fence. A single wire and a light reel and posts a person could carry. A way to make one pasture into 10 and 10 into 40, with nothing but wire and work. And Delia read the sketches by lamplight until she understood them in her hands and not just her eyes. And then she began. And the labor of that first year was rendered not in seasons but in hours, because that is how it was lived, hour by bone-deep hour. And by the end of the first week, she had strung a single wire across the near pasture and bunched the 22 cows behind it. And by the end of the 3rd week, she had them moving. A small, tight herd walking onto a fresh strip of the sorry grass every single day, and off the strip they had eaten by the next, and she walked with them, and she moved the wire with them, and she carried the reel and the posts on her shoulder, up the bare knobs and down the cut drawers, and her hands blistered, and the blisters broke and healed to callus. And by the end of the 7th week, she had worn a path in her own routine so deep she could have walked it blind, and the cattle learned it before she did, learned to wait at the wire in the grey morning for the day's fresh ground, learned to walk on when she opened it, learned her flat, low voice and her bare, flat hand. And the old brindle from the back pen walked always at the front, and Delia, who had promised herself in the plainest terms that she would not name a single one of 22 animals she might yet have to bury, held that line, and held it, and almost held it, and she named the old brindle Ruth, because Ruth was patient, and Ruth was not afraid, and Ruth had survived every reason she had been given to die, and she named no others, and she held that line the rest of the way. And the money was the hardest teacher of that first year, because there was so little of it, and Delia learned early to say a word that Wade Coleman and men like him found nearly impossible to say, and the word was no. She said it to the feed salesman who came up the lane with a plan to fatten her herd fast on bought grain, and she said it to the well driller who wanted to put her deep into debt for water she was learning to keep in the ground instead. And she said it, hardest of all, to the man from the bank in town who had heard there was a young woman out on the old Reyes place, and who offered her, kindly enough, a loan against the land to buy more cattle and more equipment, and grow, as he put it, at the speed of the market. And Delia sat across the desk from him, in her chore jacket, with her gloves in her pocket, and she thought of a line from the 6th ledger, one Emmett had written after some hard winter in some far-off year. Debt is a man telling the future what it has to do, and she told the banker no, thank you. And she drove the old truck home listening to it compose its own obituary at every stop sign, and she grew only as fast as the grass would bear, which that first year was hardly at all. And the county watched, because the county always watched, and the news of what she was doing traveled the way all news traveled in that country, through the co-op, through Loretta at the counter who had run the register for 30 years, and who was the nearest thing the whole valley had to a beating heart, everything passing through her and out again, warmed or cooled by the passing. And what went out from Loretta's counter that first year was wonder of the mocking kind, that the Reyes girl was walking her 22 bags of bones around a single wire, like a shepherd out of the Bible, moving them every day for no reason a sane person could see, letting good grass sit ungrazed while her cattle picked at a strip the size of a garden. And Wade Coleman, when it reached him, laughed and said what he had said at the sale, that she'd be burying them by fall, and added a new line that Loretta carried faithfully in both directions, that the girl had gone and turned a ranch into a house pet. And Delia heard all of it, because Loretta made sure she heard all of it, and she did not defend herself. And when Loretta, not unkindly, asked her straight out at the counter why she was doing it this way, Delia paid for her fencing wire and picked up her sack and said, "It's an old way." And Loretta said, "An old way of going broke." And Delia said, "That's one approach," and walked out to the truck. And Loretta watched her go, and did not quite know what to make of it, and said so, at length, to everyone. The first proof came in the spring of the second year, and it came, as the first proofs in these stories always come, in something so small that a person not watching for it would have walked past it and never known. Delia was moving the herd up the near pasture, the same near pasture she had grazed and rested and grazed and rested through the whole of the first year, opening the wire onto a fresh strip in the cool of a March morning, and she stopped, because the strip in front of her was green, not the pale sick green of the cheat and the annual weeds, but a deep low green coming up through the mashed-down thatch of last year's trampled grass, a green with breadth to the blade. And she knelt down in her jeans in the wet, and she put her fingers into it and parted it, and there at the crown, coming up shy and certain, out of the dirt that had been bare hardpan 18 months before, was the good grass, the deep native bunch grass, the little blue stem, and the sidiotes, and the buffalo grass, that Emmett had named in his ledgers as the grass the country grew before the country was grazed to death, the grass whose seed had lain in that soil all along, 10 years, 20, waiting in the dark the way seed waits, for a single season of rest and one thin skin of mulch and a little held water, waiting, as Emmett had written, because the ground remembers, and Delia knelt there a long time with the green in her fingers, and did not perform anything, because there was no one to perform for. and her face did the thing her face did, which was almost nothing, and then she took out the stub of pencil she carried, and the folded paper, and she wrote down the date and the pasture, and the words, Little Blue Stem, near pasture, on its own, and she underlined it once, the way Emmett underlined, pressing hard, and she moved the cattle on. And she carried a single blade of it back to the house that evening, and laid it on the kitchen table in front of her grandmother, and Alma Reyes picked it up in fingers gone to knots and roots themselves, and she looked at it against the lamplight, and she was quiet a long time, longer than the moment seemed to need, and then she said, "My father used to say this grass would come back if you gave the ground back its memory." And she laid the blade down gentle on the oilcloth, and she said, "I never once saw it come back. In 70 years I never saw it." And she looked at her granddaughter across the little table, and she said, 4 words only, "That is the one." And it was not clear at first whether she meant the grass or the girl or both. And Delia understood, later, that Alma had meant both, and that it was the nearest thing to open praise the old woman had spoken in the whole of the 11 months Delia had lived under her roof. And Delia let it sit in the air the length of time it had earned. And then she put the blade of grass between the pages of the first ledger, next to the line pressed nearly through the paper, and she left it there. And the second year the herd changed, slow, the way real things change, and the ribs that had counted themselves at the back pens went under a smooth coat, one animal at a time, and the hips filled, and the 22 cows that were supposed to be dead by the fall of the first year were not dead, not one of them, and in the spring of that second year, 14 of them dropped calves in the good grass, strong dark calves that stood and sucked within the hour, and Ruth, the old brindle, dropped a heifer calf, so stout and bright-eyed, that Delia broke her own rule a second time, and did not name it, but caught herself wanting to, and let the wanting be enough. And the herd went from 22 to 36, and Delia did not sell the increase, and did not borrow against it, and did not rush out to buy more. She kept the calves, and grew the herd only as fast as the grass could carry it, which was now, for the first time, a little faster than nothing, and she cut 2 new pastures out of the old ones with Emmett's cheap wire, and the resting grew longer, and the grazing grew tighter, and the green crept out from the near pasture into the country beyond it, one rested strip at a time, and where the green went, the bare ground closed behind it, and the cut draws stopped cutting, and began, in their bottoms, to heal. And the county went on watching, and the county went on talking, and the talk shifted a half degree that second year, not to belief, nothing so quick as belief, but to a puzzlement, with an edge of unease under it, because the Reyes girls' sorry cattle were fat. Anybody driving the county road could see they were fat, fatter than they had any business being on that broken ground, and nobody could say quite how. And Wade Coleman, driving past on his way to his own green irrigated bottoms, saw the fat cattle and the spreading grass, and he did not laugh the way he had laughed, and he did not stop either. He drove on, and at the co-op counter when Loretta brought it up, he waved a hand and said it was a wet year, that anybody's grass looked good in a wet year, and that the real test of a country and a herd and a fool notion of ranching was not a wet year. The real test was a dry one, and let her hit a real drought with those methods and see what walked off the place. And Loretta carried that too, faithfully, in both directions, and it reached Delia at the counter with her sack of wire, and Delia paid and picked up her sack and said, "He's not wrong," and Loretta blinked, because she had expected the flat deflection and gotten instead a kind of agreement, and Delia said it again, quieter, more to herself than to Loretta. The dry year is the real test, and she drove home, and that night she read again in the ledgers everything Emmett had written about the dry years, the long entries, the hard ones, and she read them the way you read a map of country you know you are going to have to cross. The dry year came in the 3rd year, And it did not come the way weather usually comes, all at once with a sky full of intent. It came the way real drought comes, which is by subtraction, by the thing that does not happen. And what did not happen was the spring rain, and then what did not happen was the early summer rain, and then what did not happen was any rain at all. And the county went from green to gold to the flat dead tan of a country giving up. And the stock tanks pulled back from their banks and cracked their mud and shrank to soup and then to nothing. And the good grass on the good bottoms cured out and browned and stopped. And the men who had grazed their pastures the old common way turned out and left to graze, watched the last of their forage go, and knew, with the sick certainty of people who have seen it before, exactly how this went. It went like this. First you fed hay you had not planned to feed, out of the barn, until the barn was empty. Then you bought hay, at drought prices, which is to say at the worst prices there are, hay hauled in from 3 counties over, and 4, until the buying ate whatever the year might have earned, and then began to eat the years behind it. Then, when the bought hay cost more than the cattle could ever be worth, you did the thing every rancher in a hard drought finally does. You sold, and because every rancher was selling at once, the sale barns filled, and the prices fell through the floor. And you hauled your cattle to town in the heat and dust, and took whatever the glutted market gave you. Cents on the dollar. Breeding stock you had spent 20 years building, sold off by the pound like scrap. And you came home to an empty country and a mortgage, and did the arithmetic of starting over at 50 or 60 or 70. And some men did not find a number they could live with. And Wade Coleman, whose bottom land was green because Wade Coleman had wells and pumps and pipe, and the debt that all of it rode on, watched his pumps run, and his fuel bills climb, and his aquifer, the same aquifer under the whole valley, drop and drop under the pull of every pump in the county, running day and night against the same dry sky. And even Wade, with his 400 head and his good bottoms, began that summer to feel the floor of the thing move under him. And out on the broken ground at the end of the washed-out lane, on the ranch that everyone agreed was the sorriest piece of country in the valley, a strange thing was happening, that first no one saw, and then no one could stop looking at. And the strange thing was that the Reyes place was green. Not lush, not irrigated green, not the false wet green of Wade's pumped bottoms, but a real, low, living green. A country holding its color into a drought that had turned all the country around it to bone. And it was green because of everything Delia had done in the 2 years the county had spent laughing. Because the deep native grass she had brought back had roots that went down 8 feet and 10 after the falling water, where the shallow weeds of her neighbors' pastures had roots that went down 8 inches and died in a month. And because the rested pastures held a thick thatch of mulch that shaded the ground and cut the wind and kept what little moisture there was from burning off. And because the soil itself, fed for 2 years, rebuilt for 2 years, had become a thing that could drink a rain when it came and hold it like a sponge instead of shedding it off a crust into the drawers. And because Delia, reading the drought coming in the ledgers before it arrived, had done in the spring the thing Emmett had written to do, had grazed lighter and moved faster, and banked forage standing in her rested pastures the way another rancher banks money, so that when the rains stopped she had, quite literally, months of grass standing in reserve on the stalk, cured and waiting, and she moved her herd through it slow and careful, a fresh strip a day, and her cattle stayed fat while the county's cattle starved, and she never fed a single bale of bought hay, and she never ran a pump, because she had almost no well to run, and she never hauled a single animal to the glutted sale barn, and the herd that everyone had said would be coyote dinners by the first fall walked through the worst drought in 40 years, slick and bred and calm, on grass, on the sorriest ground in the valley, which was not the sorriest ground in the valley anymore, and had not been for some time. The word of it went out the way all word went out, through the co-op counter, through Loretta, but it went out, changed now. It went out with the mockery burned off it, because there is a kind of fact that even a gossip cannot make small, and the fact was too large, and too green, and too plainly visible from the county road for anyone to wave away as a wet year fluke, because there was no wet year to blame it on. The whole world had gone to tan, and one ranch had stayed alive, and the men who had laughed drove out of their way now, to drive the county road slow past the Reyes fence line, and look at the green over the wire, and the fat cattle standing in it. And they did not laugh, and some of them stopped, and stood at the fence a long time not saying anything. Ranchers who had just hauled a lifetime's breeding to the sale barn for scrap prices, looking through the wire at what their own grandfathers had maybe once known, and their fathers had forgotten, and they had never been taught. A living country in a dying year. And the looking did something to them that the laughing never could have. And Delia, when she found a man standing at her fence, did not gloat and did not lecture. She walked over with her gloves in her pocket, and stood on her side of the wire, and answered what he asked, and no more, and mostly what they asked, once they got the pride down far enough to ask it, was how. And Delia would say, "It's an old way," and where before that answer had been an ending, it was now, for the first time, a beginning, because now they wanted the old way, and she told them, plainly, the wire and the bunch and the move and the rest, the whole simple, hard, patient thing, and some of them heard it and some of them could not yet hear it, but the seed of it went out over her fence line that summer, and lodged in the county the way the blue stem seed had lain in her own soil, waiting. And one evening late in that dry summer, in the long gold light, a truck came up the washed-out lane that Delia knew without being told, a big, clean truck that had never had a reason to come up her lane before. And Wade Coleman got out of it, and he stood by his truck a moment, looking at the green pasture and the fat cattle the way the others had, and then he walked over to the corral fence where Delia was forking the day's grass, and he took off his hat, which was a thing, and he was quiet a while, and then he said, "I've been ranching this county 40 years, and I told half of it you'd have those cows in the ground by fall, the first fall." And Delia said nothing, and kept forking grass, and Wade said, "And here they stand, and the whole rest of the county's at the sale barn giving their herds away, and mine's alive on a fuel bill that's killing me slower than the drought's killing them." And he turned his hat in his hands, and he said the sentence he had come up the lane to say, which cost him more than the loan the banker had offered her. He said, "I was wrong, and I've been telling folks I was wrong, and I wanted to tell you to your face." And he did not make a large production out of it. He put his hat back on, and he asked her, straight, a man asking a thing he did not know how to do from someone half his age who knew how to do it, whether she'd come look at his bottoms and tell him where he'd gone wrong, and how a man might start over doing it her way, the old way. And Delia set the fork down and looked at him a moment across the wire, and she said, "It's not my way, it's my great-grandfather's." And Wade said, "Then I owe him an apology too." And Delia almost smiled, which for her was a great deal, and she said she'd come by in the week, and Wade Coleman drove back down the lane, a smaller and a better man than he had driven up it. And Loretta, when she heard, which was within the day, carried that too in both directions, that Wade Coleman had taken off his hat to the Reyes girl, and said out loud he'd been wrong, and the county turned that sentence over and over, and something in the county turned with it. And Delia went and walked Wade's bottoms with him that week, and showed him where the water ran off, and where the grass was the wrong grass, and how he might, over years, not seasons, bring it back. And she took no money for it, and would take none. And when Wade pressed, she said only, "Teach it to somebody else. That's the payment. Pass it on." And Wade did, in time, and that was how it spread, hand to hand. Alma Reyes died in the fall of that third year, and she died the way she had lived, without production, on the porch in the last warm light of an afternoon, with a bowl of peas half-shelled in her lap, and the can beside her, and her granddaughter's herd, grazing green in the near pasture below her. And Delia found her there when she came down from the fence at dusk, and the old woman looked asleep, and Delia stood on the step a long time, and did not perform grief, because there was no one to perform it for, and because it was not a performing kind of grief. It was the older, quieter kind, and she sat down on the porch boards beside her grandmother's chair, and finished shelling the peas into the can, one at a time, because it seemed the right thing to do, and because her hands needed something to do, and the light went down over the ridge, and the cattle grazed on, and a screen door somewhere in her memory banged, and she stayed there in the dark a long while. And the funeral was up on the ridge in the family plot beside Emmett Reyes and the others whose names were on the stones, and Delia had expected almost no one, because Alma had outlived nearly everyone she had known, and had never, in 86 years, done a single thing to gather a crowd. And Delia was wrong, because the county came, and it came in numbers that told Delia something she had not known she was waiting to be told. It came in the persons of the ranchers who had stood at her fence, Wade Coleman, with his hat in his hands again, and the Hendricks family, and the Tallies, and old man Pruitt, who had run cattle in that country 60 years, and Loretta from the co-op, who cried openly and without shame, and the man from the bank, and a dozen more, filing up the ridge in their clean shirts, to stand around the grave of a woman who had said maybe 1,000 words to the whole of them across a lifetime. And Delia stood at the head of the grave in her grandmother's brown work coat, which was hers now, and she understood as she looked at their faces that they had not come only for Alma, that they had come, in a way none of them would ever say plainly, for her, that the county had made its judgment of the Reyes place, and its judgment had been wrong, and this was the county correcting itself, quietly, with its hats in its hands. The only way a country like that ever apologizes, by showing up, and Delia let the fact of it settle on her shoulders the way a coat settles, the weight of belonging to a place that had decided, at last, to belong to her back. And when it was over, and the others had gone back down the ridge, Delia stayed, and it was then that she remembered the envelope, because months before, in the spring, Alma had done a strange thing. She had given Delia a sealed envelope, plain, unlabeled, and told her not to open it until she was gone. And Delia had put it in the first ledger next to the blade of blue stem and the underlined line, and had not looked at it since. And she went down to the house now in the dusk, and took it out, and sat at the kitchen table, where Alma had shelled 10,000 bowls of peas, and she opened it. And inside was a single sheet in Alma's crabbed hand, and it did not say what Delia had braced herself for. It did not speak of love or of death. It said, in Alma's economical way, only this, that the boy Toby Hale, who was the 15-year-old grandson of the Hendricks hired man, and who had been coming around the Reyes place all that dry summer to help Delia move wire for no pay but the work itself, was, in Alma's judgment, the one. And under that, Alma had written, "Watch his hands. He doesn't fight the stock. He listens to them. My father had hands like that, and so do you, and so does he. Teach him everything, and pass on the place to him when your own time comes the way it was passed to you. That is the whole of what I know worth knowing." And it was signed only, A. And Delia sat with that a long time in the lamplight, because she had not known that Alma had been watching the boy, had not known the old woman was still, at 86, reading hands across a corral, and marking who had them and who did not. And she thought of Toby, quiet and steady, calming a nervous heifer with a bare palm the way Delia calmed them, the way she had watched Alma tell her Emmett once did. And she understood that the old woman had, in the last spring of her life, identified the next keeper of the ground before anyone else had thought to look, and had set it down in a sealed envelope as a fact offered for consideration, the way she offered everything, and Delia folded the letter and put it back in the first ledger with the grass blade, and the line pressed nearly through the page. The ground remembers. And she went out onto the dark porch and sat in her grandmother's chair. And she did not cry, exactly. She sat with the thing that was older and quieter than triumph, and older and quieter than grief, and made of both at once. The knowledge that the two people who would have been proudest to see the green come back to the ground, Emmett, who wrote it, and Alma, who waited 70 years for it, were both of them up on the ridge under the stones, and neither of them there to see it, and that this, too, was part of it, that the ground remembers longer than the people do, and that the remembering has to be handed forward, or it dies with the hands that hold it. And she resolved, sitting in the dark in the brown coat, to hand it forward. She taught the boy everything, across the 4th year and the years after it, the way Alma had told her to, and it was not a thing of lessons and lectures, it was a thing of hours, of the two of them out before the light moving the wire, and the herd, and Delia treating Toby Hale from the first day, not as a boy to be trained, but as a hand who already knew, which is the only way anyone ever learns to be what they are. And she watched his hands the way Alma had told her to watch them, and Alma had been right. The boy did not fight the stock. He waited on them. He put a bare palm on a shoulder and stood until the animal decided, and the herd took to him the way it had taken to her. And Ruth, the old brindle, older now, grey around the muzzle, still walking at the front of the bunch, let the boy scratch the pole between her horns, in a way she let almost no one. And Delia, watching that, knew that the old woman's judgment had been sound. And one evening at the corral, she caught the boy's eye across the fence and said, "Without preamble, you have the hands." And Toby, who did not know the weight of what he was being handed, said, "Sir, ma'am, what?" And Delia said only, "My grandmother saw it, and my great-grandfather had it, and it doesn't come often, so don't waste it." And the boy did not understand. Not then, but he would, and it lodged in him and grew. And the green kept spreading, not only across the Reyes place, which by the 4th year and the 5th was green corner to corner, the bare knobs healed over, and the cut draws grassed in, and running clear little threads of water, where for 40 years there had been dry, cracked dirt. But across the county, because the drought had broken more than the county's cattle, it had broken the county's certainty, and a certainty once broken lets new things in, and the new thing was the old thing, Emmett's thing, and one rancher at a time, the valley began to bunch its cattle and move them and rest the ground, some taught by Delia at their own fences, and some taught by Wade Coleman, who became, in the odd way of converts, the loudest evangelist the method ever had, telling anyone who would stand still that the Reyes girl had been right and he had been a fool, and not making, for once in his life, a large production of anything except his own past foolishness, which he seemed almost to enjoy confessing, and the reputation of the place went outward through the quiet channels that Delia never once advertised into, because that was not how the worth of a real thing travels. It travels the way one craftsman recognizes another, and it began with the buyer from the beef co-op, a careful, unhurried man who came out one fall to look at Delia's cattle and walked the pastures with her a whole day and put his hand into the deep soil and smelled it, and said one understated sentence, "This is the best grass-finished country I've walked in this state." And it went on to a chef from 300 miles away, who drove out because the co-op buyer had told him where the beef came from, and who stood at the fence and looked at the green and the cattle, and said very little, and bought everything Delia would sell him, and came back for more. And word of the ranch that stayed green in the great drought became, without Delia ever seeking it, a small, quiet legend in the parts of the world that care about such things. And people wrote to her, and some came, and Delia answered the ones she could, and taught the ones who truly wanted to learn, and turned away no one who came humble, and took on, always, only what the ground could bear, and grew only as fast as the grass would grow, and never once, in all of it, went into debt, because debt is a man telling the future what it has to do, and Delia had learned to let the future alone, and let the ground remember at its own pace, and she wrote it all down, every season, in new ledgers in her own upright hand, next to Emmett's 9, the rains to the 10th of an inch, and the dates the grasses greened, and where the herd grazed, and for how long, keeping the chart of the living thing going forward, the way it had been kept going before her. And she showed the boy Toby how to keep it too, and made him keep his own, because a thing written down is a thing that can be handed forward, and the handing forward was the whole point, was the thing Alma had died knowing, and Emmett had died writing, that the ground remembers, but only if the people remember to let it. The morning of the county dispersal sale, 4 years to the season from the morning it began, there were 19 good cows in a lot at the front of the Callahan County stockyard that everybody wanted, and they were Delia Reyes's cows, though that is not why she was there. She had not brought cattle to sell. She had come to buy, because the drought had broken a neighbor 2 ridges over, a young family gone under, the way the county's families went under in the dry years, and their herd was being sold off in pieces, and among the pieces, shoved into the far back pen where the sun came hardest, were the culls nobody wanted. A lot of thin, hard-luck cows run down on run-down ground, standing without complaint with their hips gone sharp, and their ribs counting themselves, and the crowd moved through the good pens up front, and away from the back the way the crowd always moves, and Delia walked past the good pens where the money was, and she walked past the sleek baldies, and the fat feeder steers, and she walked all the way to the back, and she stood at the rail with her gloves in her back pocket, and her hands on the top wire, older now, the scar still through her eyebrow, and the braid still black over the shoulder of the brown coat that had been Alma's and Emmett's before her. And she read the thin cattle the way she had read them at 28, and she saw the hunger, and she saw the thing under the hunger, and the thing under the hunger was that they were not sorry cows, they were just hungry, and there is a difference, and by now the whole county knew there was a difference, because she had taught it to them. And a voice came up beside her, and it was Wade Coleman, older too, and he stood at the back pens where a man like Wade Coleman had once had no reason to stand, and he looked at the thin cattle, and then at Delia, and he said, "You looking at those?" And Delia said she was. And Wade did not laugh. Wade nodded slow and said, "Those are the ones, aren't they? The ones nobody can read." And Delia said, "Those are the ones." And it was the old refrain of the place now, passed from her back to the man who had once mocked it. Those are the ones. And when the auctioneer came at last to the back pens the way you get to the dishes you have put off, and opened the sorry lot low, and got the embarrassed silence they always got, Delia lifted 2 fingers off the rail, and there was no laughter in the room this time. There was instead a kind of quiet, because the room knew now what those 2 fingers meant. The room had watched for 4 years what those 2 fingers meant, and the gavel came down and the thin cattle were hers, and she would take them home to the green country at the end of the washed-out lane, and put them on the good grass, and walk them slow behind the single wire, until the ribs went under a smooth coat, one animal at a time, and she would be, in the doing of it, paying a debt, not a debt of money. She owed no money, and never would, but the other kind, the kind Alma had named for her in the sealed envelope, the kind you pay by passing it on, and standing beside her at the rail was the boy, Toby Hale, near 20 now himself, with the hands, and Delia turned to him and said, "Load them easy, don't rush them, put your palm on the shoulder and wait," and the young man went to do it, and did it right, and Delia watched him a moment with a look on her face that was almost nothing, and was everything. And then she looked back at the thin cattle that were hers, the sorry ones, the ones nobody wanted. And she thought of Emmett, who had built the wrong barn on purpose, and Alma, who had waited 70 years to see the grass come home, and neither of them there. And she thought, the ground remembers. And she said it once, low, to no one, to the cattle, to the boy, to the two up on the ridge. The ground remembers, and it was enough. And if you have stayed with me all the way to the end of this, then let me ask you the last thing. And I ask it as a small favor and not a demand, because it is the whole reason I tell these stories at all. Share this with someone you know who has been underestimated, someone who was told the thing they saw worth saving was worth nothing, because they need to hear that the world does, sometimes, if you outlast it, correct itself. And then leave me a comment and tell me about the stubborn thing in your own life that other people laughed at. The field you refused to give up on, the old way you kept when everyone said let it go, the thing you knew was worth something when no one else could read it. Tell me. I read every single one, because somewhere out there is a back pen full of the sorry ones that nobody wants, and somebody has to be the one who walks past the money, all the way to the back, and stops, and looks, and sees the thing under the hunger, and lifts 2 fingers off the rail. Let it be you.